Have you ever thought about, like, I don't know, where it all began?
Yeah, for
You
sure.
know, like, way back.
Absolutely. It's one of those big questions, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's easy to just think, oh, well, that's ancient history. It's like something so far in the past, it doesn't really matter to us today.
Yeah.
Well, you sent us this video, and it's really got us thinking about Genesis chapters 10 and 11.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and, those chapters are all about, the time after Noah's flood
Right.
and how supposedly humanity kind of branched out from there.
Yeah, the whole world repopulated and reorganized. It's a fascinating period to think about.
It is, and of course, you can't talk about that time period without talking about the Tower of Babel story.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the most iconic stories from those early chapters of Genesis.
And it really raises questions about how people formed communities, how languages developed, and the very start of cities and distinct cultures.
Yeah, that's what I find so compelling about those chapters. They try to answer some of the most fundamental questions about human origins and societies, especially if you approach them from more than just a theological perspective.
Right, like thinking about it from a historical or anthropological lens as well.
Exactly.
So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack those ideas for you.
That's good.
We're going to go back to those early chapters of Genesis and look at what they might be able to tell us about the world after the flood, that moment when humanity had to start again and understand its place in the world.
It's almost like a reset button for humanity.
It is, and the video you sent really got into this, especially with the whole family tree of Noah.
Oh, right. The generations of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and how their descendants spread out across the earth.
Yeah, and it's quite a list, isn't it?
It is. It's like reading a whole, I don't know, phone book of ancient names sometimes.
But even though it's a long list of names, there's this really interesting idea that comes out of it. Well, it seems like the story is saying that different groups of people started to form based on, well, two main things:
Okay.
language and location.
So where they settled and the language they spoke.
Yeah, and that really makes you think about how distinct cultural identities might have first appeared.
It makes a lot of sense, actually.
Right.
If you think about the original audience of these texts, language and kinship were really seen as the cornerstones of any community. It's how people understood who they were and where they belonged.
Yeah, it's kind of like belonging to a certain tribe or clan.
Exactly.
But it's not just an ancient idea either.
That's true.
Like the video creator brought up this really cool example
What was it?
about Loggy Hills Avenue and how it's named after an H family.
Oh, right, like the founders of that area.
Yeah, so it's like this really clear link between how ancient people might have named places after settlers and how we still do that today.
It's a great example of how these ancient ideas still resonate with us.
It makes it seem a lot less, dusty and old.
Right, it makes it real and relatable.
So then the video moves on to this really interesting figure, Nimrod.
Oh, yeah, Nimrod.
And he shows up in Genesis 10, verses 8 to 12.
Okay.
Now, he's described as a mighty one, a mighty hunter before the Lord, and, you're interested in how cities began.
I am. It's a fascinating subject.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting because the text connects Nimrod to the start of his kingdom.
Okay, how so?
It names places like Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar.
Wow, so those were some of the earliest city-states in Mesopotamia.
Yeah, and it goes on to say he built Nineveh, Rehoboth-Er, Calah, and a great city.
Now that's quite a list of cities attributed to him.
It is, and it got me thinking.
About what?
Well, the video creator asked this question, and it really stuck with me.
Right.
Can we automatically assume that Nimrod literally built all of those cities?
That's a good question.
Like, just because his kingdom began there, does that mean he laid every single brick?
Well, it's an interesting point to consider. Maybe attributing the founding of so many cities to one powerful figure like Nimrod was more about emphasizing his dominance and influence.
Like a way of saying he had control over a vast area.
Exactly. It might be less about him literally constructing every building and more about how these early stories might have portrayed powerful leaders and the growth of their kingdoms.
So it's more symbolic than literal.
It could be, which
Yeah.
is something we see a lot in these ancient texts.
Right, like a way of expressing complex ideas through stories and symbols.
Precisely.
Okay, so the video also talks about Canaan, and he's Ham's son, the one who's associated with that, curse.
Right.
But the video makes this really interesting observation.
Go on.
Even though there's this pronouncement about Canaan and his descendants, the text still says that they multiplied and spread out.
That's an interesting point.
It makes you wonder if maybe those kinds of divine statements were operating on a different level.
like a spiritual or symbolic level, rather than a strictly physical or literal one.
Yeah, like maybe the curse wasn't meant to literally stop them from having children and growing as a people.
Right, it might have had a different meaning or purpose altogether.
Okay, so then we get this whole list of Canaan's descendants.
Oh, right, it names the Jebusites, Amorites, Girgasites, Hivites, and so on.
And those are all groups that show up later in the biblical narrative.
They are. They're often depicted as the inhabitants of the land of Canaan, the people the Israelites encounter as they enter the Promised Land.
So this part of Genesis is like setting the stage for those later interactions and conflicts.
Exactly. It provides the backstory and explains where these different groups came from.
It's almost like a family history of the ancient Near East, seen from a particular perspective.
It is. It lays the groundwork for understanding the relationships and tensions that will play out later in the story.
And then we come to this one short verse, Genesis 10.25, and it mentions Peleg.
Okay, what about him?
Well, it says, in whose days the earth was divided.
Right, and that little verse has caused a lot of debate and discussion over the centuries.
It has, and the video kind of acknowledged the mystery around it.
It does, because it's not entirely clear what kind of division it's talking about.
Right, like what does it mean for the earth to be divided?
Some people have interpreted it literally, as in a physical splitting of continents or landmasses.
But that doesn't really fit with what we understand about geology.
It doesn't.
So what are some other possibilities?
Well, other interpretations suggest it could be a division of people, maybe a further separation based on languages or tribal affiliations.
Like a branching out into different groups and cultures?
Yeah, or it could even refer to some major political or social upheaval that happened during Peleg's lifetime.
Wow, so it's like this really brief statement that sparks a lot of different interpretations.
It does, which is part of what makes these ancient texts so fascinating.
They leave room for different perspectives and readings.
Exact.
And then, just to wrap up Genesis 10, verse 32 emphasizes this idea again.
The idea of division.
Yeah, it says that the nations were divided after the flood based on their families and languages.
So it really reinforces the idea that language played a big role in how different groups emerged and spread out.
Yeah, it's like setting the scene for what's coming next.
Which is...
The Tower of Babel.
Ah, yes, that's right.
Because now we're in Genesis 11, and verse 1 starts with this picture of everyone in the world speaking the same language.
Right, one language and one speech. It sets up a stark contrast to the diversity of languages we see today.
Yeah, and it made me think about something the video creator mentioned.
What's that?
Is there actually a difference between language and speech?
That's a good point. I hadn't really considered that before.
Could language refer to the whole system of communication, like the structure and rules?
Yeah, the underlying principles that make up a language.
Well, speech is more about the actual way it's spoken and understood within a specific community.
So like dialects, accents, and maybe even early forms of distinct languages that were developing within that one overarching language.
Yeah, maybe.
And that could mean that the confounding at Babel was even more significant.
In what way?
Well, it wouldn't just be about changing how people spoke. It would be about creating completely separate languages with their own distinct structures and rules.
Oh, wow, like a total linguistic reset.
Exactly.
Then the video talked about something that might seem like a small detail, but I think it's really important.
Okay, go listening.
It's the part where people start making bricks and using slime for mortar.
Ah, right. It's at the beginning of new building techniques and materials after the flood.
And the video creator called it the start of inventions.
It makes sense. It shows people becoming more sophisticated in their construction methods.
Right. Like they're figuring out how to build things that are more durable and permanent.
It's problem-solving and innovation, which is crucial when you're rebuilding a world.
Exactly. And it kind of sets the stage for what comes next.
Because now they have the skills and knowledge to attempt something much grander.
Yeah, the Tower of Babel. And this story is in Genesis 11, verses 4 through 9.
Okay.
So the people decide they want to build this huge city and a tower that reaches all the way to heaven.
Quite an ambition.
And they say it's to make a name for themselves, and so they won't be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth.
So there's a desire for unity, recognition, and maybe even a fear of being dispersed and losing their shared identity.
Yeah, and the video creator pointed something out that I hadn't really thought about before.
What was that?
The timeline.
In what way?
Well, was the tower just an idea?
Okay.
Or were they actually already building it when the next verse says, "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded"?
That's a good question.
It makes you wonder how far along they were in their project before, things changed.
And that phrase, "the Lord came down," it really sparks a lot of discussion, doesn't it?
It does. It brings up this whole idea of divine intervention.
Right, like God stepping in to respond to what humans are doing.
Yeah, and the video suggested that maybe it was their ambition, the sheer scale of their imagination that got God's attention.
It raises this interesting question about the relationship between human aspirations and the divine, especially in these early narratives.
Like, how far can humans go before they cross a line?
It's a question that's still relevant today.
Definitely. And then we get to this really powerful verse.
Which one is that?
And the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do."
It's a powerful statement about the potential of unity and imagination.
It is, and the video really emphasized that. Like, what could humanity achieve if it was united in a common purpose?
And if it dared to dream big and work together.
It makes you think about all the incredible things that have been accomplished throughout history through collective effort and shared goals.
Things like, I don't know, building pyramids or exploring space, things that seemed impossible at first but became possible because people worked together.
Yeah.
But the narrative here suggests that this very potential, this power to achieve almost anything through unified action, is what leads to the divine response.
Because God decides to intervene.
Right, and it's a pivotal moment in the story.
It is, because God says, "Go to, let us go down," and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech.
So by confusing their language, God disrupts their unity and their ability to work together.
The video called it an instrument of divine will.
It's a way of changing the course of human history,
And ultimately, it leads to what they were trying to avoid.
being scattered across the earth
And that's how the city gets its name, Babel.
because of the confusion of languages.
It says, "Because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth."
So this story becomes an explanation for the diversity of languages and the dispersal of people across the globe.
It's like a powerful origin myth that tries to answer some of the big questions about human existence.
And it's important to remember that this is a theological narrative. It's offering an explanation through a particular lens.
Right. It's not meant to be a literal scientific account.
But even though it's a theological story, it's had a huge cultural impact on how people understand language and the origins of different cultures.
It's shaped thinking for thousands of years.
Absolutely.
So then the video moves on to the generations of Shem.
Right. It starts tracing the lineage down towards Abraham.
It's like the narrative is narrowing its focus, moving from this big picture of humanity to a specific family line.
And that makes sense because this lineage will become central to the rest of the biblical narrative.
Yeah, it's the line that leads to the patriarchs and eventually to the Israelites.
So these genealogical lists serve as a bridge
A bridge between.
between the early history of humanity after the flood and the story of a specific group of people who will play a key role in the unfolding narrative.
And finally, we get to the family of Terah, Abraham's father.
Right, and we learn about Abraham's brothers, Nahor and Haran.
And there's that sad detail about Haran dying before his father.
It adds a touch of tragedy to the family history,
It does, and then we see the theme of family connections continuing.
with marriages within the family.
Yeah, like Nahor marrying Milcah, his brother's daughter.
Right, which was a common practice in those times.
It was, and then there's the important detail about Abraham's wife, Sarai.
Ah, yes, the first barrenness mentioned in this lineage.
It's a detail that will have major implications for the story going forward.
It will, because it sets up the need for divine intervention and a miracle to fulfill God's promise to Abraham.
And the chapter ends with them migrating from Ur to Haran.
And Terah dies there.
It really feels like the stage is being set for Abraham's story to begin.
Absolutely. And the focus shifts from this grand narrative of humanity to the more personal story of one man and his family.
It's a turning point.
It is.
So to wrap up this whole deep dive, we've explored a lot of ground.
We have.
We've looked at how Genesis describes the repopulation of the earth after the flood.
Right. And the emergence of those first cities and distinct groups of people,
And we've talked about that pivotal story of the Tower of Babel.
which tries to explain the origin of different languages and the scattering of people across the globe,
And finally, we trace the family line that leads to Abraham.
who will become a central figure in the next part of the biblical narrative.
It's a mix of history, origin stories, and theological interpretation.
And it raises so many questions about what it means to be human, to be part of a community, and to leave a lasting legacy.
It does. And thinking about everything we've discussed today, what stands out to you?
Well, what really struck me is this constant tension between the human desire for unity and the forces that lead to diversity and separation.
It's like we're constantly trying to balance those two impulses,
We are.
to come together and build something lasting, but also to express our individuality and create our own identities.
And these stories, even though they're ancient, still offer valuable insights into those very human dynamics.
They do, and as you reflect on those stories, think about what they might tell us about our own desires for connection, for achievement, and for leaving our mark on the world.
And how those desires might sometimes clash with the need to embrace difference and navigate a world where everyone is trying to find their place.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We really appreciate you sending us this thought-provoking material.
You're welcome.
It's given us all a lot to ponder.
It has.